Hi, a Cultivated Life community. It's been a while since I've done a video with you guys. I'm excited to check in and see how you're doing. Each week when I go live on Wednesdays, it's usually to follow up on the Monday Cultivated Life Challenge. However, in the last few challenges, we haven't had any feedback in the group for people just kind of saying that you're participating or whether kind of how God is showing up. And so it's fine. I just kind of want to know, are these challenges helpful for you? Is it too much? Am I putting too much information in there that maybe it's too hard to do and I could scale it back and make it easier? The goal here is ultimately to just take one step a week and consider some area that we can be active participants with God as we cultivate a life that relies on God. Speaking of reliance, this week's topic is on selfishness and self-protection. And this kind of started as a follow-up to a piece I wrote originally last year on iBelieve that they changed the title on it. It's 10 Things Selfish People Always Do in Relationships. And I got a lot of feedback on that particular article and said that I was going to write future follow-up pieces and never did. So somebody had messaged me and I realized that and said, oh my goodness, okay, here's a couple of ideas. And I presented it to my email list and asked them which ones they'd like to hear from me on. And one of them was on how to know whether or not selfishness is just simply self-protection. And so that is the first article that got published, I think it was last week while I was out. And it talked about kind of how in the beginning of my intensive healing journey. Been on healing journeys in the past, but after our time of serving on the ranch, which was a foster ranch, we served there in 2012. We lived there for 14 months on 156 acres out in the country. We had up to 12 children living with us, and the dynamics of living there were really pretty extreme in a lot of ways. Extreme spiritually, I felt a lot of spiritual shifts just in the area, which I'm fairly sensitive to, and I'm also fairly skeptical of some of those, kind of the way that people talk about some of those things, but I experienced things I had never experienced during my time there that could be kind of scary, but we had to turn on God's Word, which I couldn't get through any electronic service except for the CDs that I had. We couldn't get cell service, we couldn't get connection to hardly anything. We were isolated in a number of ways. It felt like living in another country, even though it was just in Texas. Anyway, so spiritually, emotionally, incredibly exhausting, physically exhausting. The number of things that broke were crazy. The number of situations that we had with the children was intense. And of course, just even relationally for my own marriage and with my children, a lot of those things were significantly intense for those 14 months. Well, when I came home, I eventually was diagnosed with acute anxiety, never officially diagnosed with PTSD, but there were definite signs of PTSD, and I felt it in my body all the time. The immense buildup of stress, the immense buildup of pain and emotions that hadn't been processed, and grief and confusion about what had been happening, and also God reshaping me incredibly during that time. He was taking me from a life of a lot of fears, and even ignoring those fears for a while, seeming to be much better than I was right after high school, but ultimately those fears were still holding me back, and I'm still growing out of them, but he's changed me immensely, and it began at the ranch. And so that was just a pivotal time, even though it was extremely difficult and extremely challenging. God used it in amazing ways, particularly the healing journey afterwards. And so having this buildup of immense tension inside of my body, and it was just too much for my brain and my body to process. And I literally felt like nerves were just going to pop out of my skin at any moment. It was not fun. So let's say somebody dropped something in the kitchen and I would just, significant reaction. We'd been in hyper vigilance mode, watching for kids that might harm each other or be where they weren't supposed to be or get harmed in a certain way, and watching up anywhere from 8 to 12 children at a time, making sure that they were all safe, and then having numerous even sliding glass doors in their bedrooms where they can get out, was just challenging in and of itself. So anyway, so that reaction, that's a startle reflex, right? And I might respond with yelling, or I know I responded to my kids sometimes saying, "What are you doing? Stop that!" And shortly after, I would catch myself and I'd realize it wasn't their fault, and here I am yelling at them. And so what I was doing was out of a self-protective response, because my body had learned so much how to react to potential threats that I felt that potential threat all the time. And so even though it was something so minor, my body was overreacting to that and reacting to and in a self-protective mode that wasn't necessary anymore. So at the ranch, when something would happen, let's say 2 kids were fighting and they could be very, very aggressive with each other, then there was reason for me to jump up and engage, right? The reflex, the response there had a purpose, and it was a good purpose. And it was also self-protective for myself when they wanted to pick up an object and throw it at us, particularly more damaging objects. And so that would be a natural, healthy response. Kept stopping that from happening, stopping harm from happening. But when those self-protective measures that begin at some point, whether it's in childhood or through one experience or even a series of experiences in our lives, we build in a belief system that we don't necessarily even know that we believe, but it's a belief system that is kind of like the engine and how we operate, that we're not safe. And so it takes quite a bit of work, both physiologically, neurologically, spiritually. I did different healing ministries to help my body settle down, and also those experiences with God, and particularly with Unleash sheets and EMDR and some other therapies that I did to frame a new experience in my body so that those self-protective measures would not become selfish, self-focused, and self-reliant ways of living in the future. One of the reasons that I wrote this article about whether or not it's self-protection, if it's simply self-protection, is because there are times when we can look at something that somebody's doing and judge that behavior and response quickly and just take a complex response with a complex background that involves mind, body, spirit, and numerous of experiences and beliefs, and winnow it down to a sin of selfishness that we just need to get better at. And that's not healing or helpful. And so it's not to say that selfishness is a good thing, because it certainly isn't. Clearly, we are to lay down our lives. We are to surrender our lives for the sake of Christ. We, because of Christ, we can pour out so much to other people. But what gets a couple of things that I see happening is, one, the quickness to term certain things as selfish, rather than stopping our own quick reaction and jumping to saying that it's selfish, either for us or for somebody else, pausing and asking God to give us a new sight, a new line of vision for that person, for ourselves, even if it's us that's reacting in that space. And that gives us an opportunity to see beyond the behavior and to care about what's underneath it, which gives them an opportunity, or even ourselves, if we're having compassion for ourselves, an opportunity to heal so that future moments don't continue like that. Instead of cutting off the behavior at the quick, immediately calling it sin and focusing on it as being selfish, we find that there's a bigger picture, and we have a really big God who is so vast and so beyond in his ways of reaching into our hearts, beyond in his ways of healing us. We can see more of that when we're able to go beyond the quick judgment point. Now I forgot what the other point was that I was going to make, but the other thing is to identify the self-protection is to identify ways that may not be healthy for us anymore. So I mentioned how I had those startle reflexes when there was actually danger happening at the ranch, but it wasn't helpful when I yelled at my kids And so I needed to be able to identify those and then ask God, if I didn't know that it was this clear event, if I was having this type of reaction in some other part of my life, asking God, where did this come from? What do you have to say to me about it? Using the unleash sheets, you can just say in what's happening, it's a box, it's a section in those sheets, and saying, I am realizing that when people say this or do this, they say something to me that feels really negative, but I realize it's not all that negative and I'm taking it this way, or somebody has a tone of voice that I respond to in a certain way. When we start to recognize those patterns in ourselves, then we can go back and ask God to speak to it. And in the unleash sheets, when you identify what's happening and then go through the thoughts and identify some of the feelings that are tied to it, because we are complex beings and it's all tied together. And then we're stepping back and asking God to speak to our spirits and to reveal more of himself. And it may have to do with what we've presented in the what's happening section. And he may end up wanting to speak to us about something else, but we're making space to hear from him. And that can be a powerful way to heal and to grow from self-protective measures. So the challenge this week was to ask God, what is one way that I self-protect that is no longer helpful? Help me to see that particular way of self-protecting and actually be thankful and thank God for giving me that way of protecting myself when it was needed, and appreciating that and having gratitude for it, and just thanking God and thanking your body and that you've had the gift of being able to protect yourself when it was needed. And then asking God to reveal, how is it impacting my life today? So if I'm having this continued reaction, and specifically when somebody has a particular tone of voice or they respond in a certain way, it is no longer helpful. And it is becoming reliant on self to continue self-protecting when we don't need to. And God's protection is with us. So he gives us the protection that we need when harm is present, but our bodies and our spirits can still remember and feel like we need that self-protection and find it hard to trust him and the protection that he gives in new experiences. So by taking the time this week in the Cultivated Life Challenge to ask God, what is a way that was self-protection right now? Show me when it entered my life, and taking the time to be grateful for that. And then show me how it's happening right now. And if in that process, you might realize, wow, my self-protective measures have actually been harming somebody else, or it's hurting them. And I can understand that because that would be hard for me. And then you can take restorative and redemptive steps after that and say, you know what, God has been showing me that when I hear you say this, it makes me want to respond in a certain way, and that's really not about you, it's about past experiences, and I want to apologize because I imagine that might be hurtful for you. It's an area that I'm growing in, so pray for me because I need to do that. So yes, Cicely says, storing the pain and memories in the body is so real, and it is hindering us. And it's really powerful. I know that the book, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, has been instrumental for so many people. And one of the things that I love about it is that it is helping us go from a shallow faith that just goes back to what I was talking about before. Oh, whoops, that's sinful behavior. You have to stop and you have to change it and be better the next time. To engaging in a richer experience with God, which allows us the opportunity to experience so much more of him. And I find that a huge, huge blessing. I hope that this challenge has been encouraging for you. I would love to hear when I post the challenges on Mondays. Just set aside some time to either come back to it or set a reminder if it's something that feels kind of challenging at the beginning of the week. And if I need to do it on a different day that works better for a majority of people, let me know. But the idea there is you can search the hashtag cultivate life and choose something that actually God is already maybe stirring up within you, or making space and asking God if he has something to say about that in your life. By doing so, we are engaging with him in an active process that allows the Holy Spirit to change us and shape us so that we can experience more of God and more of the life that God has given us. I pray you have a blessed week and are excited about the holidays. I will check in with you again next Wednesday.